Welcome back to day 2 of the APAICS Tech Summit. I am Madalene Mielke, President and CEO of APAICS. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to our summit partners, Amazon, Apple, AT&T, Comcast, CTIA, Dell, DoorDash, Toyota, Charter, Entertainment Software Association, Microsoft, Netflix, Salesforce, and T-Mobile. We'd also like to thank all of our special guest speakers, panelists, and moderators. Our partnership enables APAICS to fulfill its mission of promoting AA and NHPI participation and representation at all levels of the political process, from community service to elected office. I am thrilled to introduce our next speaker, KPAC Chair and APAICS Board Member, Congresswoman Judy Chu. Congresswoman Chu was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2009. In 2011, she was elected chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, which advocates for the needs and concerns of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community across the nation. She helps lead the Tri-Caucus, a joint effort of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Congresswoman Chu also currently serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over legislation pertaining to taxes, revenues, Social Security, and Medicare. In that committee, Congresswoman Chu is a member of the subcommittees on health, giving her oversight over healthcare reform and crucial safety net programs, worker and family support, and oversight. She also serves on the House Small Business Committee, which has oversight of the Small Business Administration, as well as the House Budget Committee. Please join me in welcoming KPAC Chair, Congresswoman Judy Chu.
Hello, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu from California's 28th District, and as the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call KPAC, I'm so gratified to be with you today for the APAICS Tech Summit to introduce the panel on the impact of increased competition between the U.S. and China. And let me thank APAICS fearless leader, Madalene Mielke, for ensuring that today's summit includes this discussion on such an important topic. This is such a critical opportunity for us to explore how American competitiveness and innovation can be bolstered without making immigrant communities, including Chinese and Asian American communities, collateral damage. At KPAC, we strongly support strengthening our economy and protecting our national security. We also know that there are legitimate concerns with the actions of the Government of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, that warrant investigation and criticism. However, as Congress holds hearings, considers legislation, and talks about strategic competition between the U.S. and the PRC, we must also be vigilant about the language we use and policies we craft to ensure that entire communities are not caught in the crosshairs. We know that xenophobic, anti-Asian rhetoric and scapegoating historically results in physical violence and emotional harm against Asian Americans across the country. We saw this over the past 3 years with 11,500 recorded anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic and the former president's repeated use of the words Kung Flu and China virus. We saw this with the Department of Justice's China Initiative, which racially profiled innocent Chinese academics and researchers like Dr. Gang Chen, Anming Hu, and Xiaosheng Xi under the auspices of national security and economic espionage. While they were eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, they lost their careers in the process. We saw this with the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982, a Chinese-American man who was killed by 2 laid-off auto workers that blamed their job losses to Asian people during a climate of economic competition with Japan. We saw this with the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, when 120,000 people lost everything they had based on the accusation that there were spies amongst them, when to this day not a single case of espionage by Japanese Americans was ever proven. We saw this with the lynchings of Chinese immigrants during the height of the Yellow Peril era in the 1800s by white workers who blamed them for alleged economic displacement. This anti-Asian rhetoric that inspired so many of these incidents has been on many of our minds as we continue to see frequent attacks on Asian Americans, verbal, physical, and sometimes fatal, at the same time that we are renewing our focus on strategic competition with the PRC. In fact, just last year, as Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act, a bill aimed at bolstering America's competitiveness and innovation, CAPAC fought to ensure that 4 specific provisions that would be incredibly harmful to our communities by profiling Chinese researchers and scientists were kept out of the bill. Thanks to the advocacy of so many of our partners, many of whom you will hear from during this panel, and the work of CAPAC's members, I am proud to say that none of the harmful sections were in the final bill that President Biden signed into law. But this is just one example, and we have many more of these fights ahead. From members trying to reinstate the China Initiative to restrictions on property ownership that some of my colleagues are proposing for Chinese nationals, we must ensure that the heightened focus on U.S.-China relations does not occur on the backs of our communities or at the expense of our civil rights. So I truly appreciate the conversation you are having today, and I thank the panelists for their tireless efforts working with CAPAC to ensure that we are doing all we can to protect our communities. I look forward to partnering with all of you as we ensure that competition between the U.S. and PRC does not come at the expense of our communities. Thank you again for inviting me to join you today.
Thank you for your remarks, Congresswoman Chu. Our first panel of the day highlights the impact of increased competition between the United States and China. Competition between the US and China in STEM is reshaping the global technology landscape, with both countries striving to achieve different global orders. This competition within the tech sector has been driven partly by values and economics and will shape the rest of the 21st century. This panel will explore how anti-China rhetoric and policy impact AA and NHPI engineers and scientists, along with the greater community, and how we can navigate this precarious landscape within the tech industry and beyond. Our moderator for this session is Kimmy Yam. Kimmy is an award-winning Asian American journalist. She's best known for her work covering policy and legislation, as well as her deeply reported features on complex issues impacting the Asian American community. In 2016, she helped launch HuffPost's Asian Voices section, one of 2 mainstream media verticals dedicated to the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Today, she is a reporter for NBC's Asian America section, where she aims to uplift communities that have largely been forgotten by the media ecosystem. Join me in welcoming Kimmy and our first group of panelists for the day.
Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me today. We have an awesome crew with us to talk about some really, really critical issues that are, have been in the background and are definitely going to be a huge topic of conversation as we move on in the next couple months, and especially towards the election. I am so excited to kind of chat with everyone here. I'm going to go around and have everyone introduce themselves very briefly. I think I'll start with Gisela. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you so much, Kimmy, and the APAICS team for hosting this crucial discussion. My name is Gisela Perez-Kusakawa, and I am the founding executive director for the Asian American Scholar Forum, AASF. ASF has worked on groundbreaking efforts to provide a seat at the table for the Asian American scholar community and have high-level discussions with federal agencies, the White House, university leadership, and faculty to tackle issues of importance to Asian Americans and scholars across the country and bridge the scientific and academic community with policymakers, advocates, and the general public. Very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Awesome. I'm going to kick it to Cindy.
Thank you, Kimmy, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me to speak at this panel today. My name is Cindy Tsai. I am the interim president for the Committee of 100. Since the early 2000s and with the Wen-Ho Lee case, we have been at the forefront of protecting STEM professionals from wrongful accusations of being a foreign agent or spies. Through our research and advocacy, we aim to partner with this country's leaders to identify ways to engage in strategic competition without infringing on the rights of individuals. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cindy. Let's go to John.
Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here, and thank you, Kimmy, for moderating this important discussion. My name is John Yang. I'm the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. AAJC's mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to build and promote a fair and equitable society for all. So in this space, we're one of the few organizations that have full-time staff working both on technology as well as full-time staff that work on civil rights as it intersects with national security. So we talk about these issues. It's going to affect all of us. We want to do that through advocacy. We want to do that through education, and we want to do that through empowerment of the community.
Alrighty, so I think our very first question, I'm going to start with Gisela. We are in this kind of period where we're seeing this ramp up between US and China competition. I was wondering how you felt that this has really impacted the scientific, scholarly, and academic communities. I know that I recently spoke to Xuan-Trang, I believe last year, and he mentioned that he's really stepping away from federally funded programs and grants. So, are we seeing tangible effects already?
No, that's absolutely right. And ASF was actually founded in part because of the injustice that we saw that Professor Xuan-Trang had experienced. We are all Xuan-Trang was a mantra, and this realization that the current environment really was not very friendly for Asian American scholars. There's this widespread fear that they will be scapegoated, particularly within the scientific and academic communities. And the result has been a loss of talent, diminished appeal of the United States on the global platform, and really a deterrence in their normal activities. Like Professor Xuan-Trang mentioned, and others in our membership, like Professor Xiaoxing Shi, this has really resulted in them not wanting to work on federal grants, have positions of leadership, or really stand out. And yet their expertise have been something that our country has really needed. Most recently, Professor Xuan-Trang has actually created an innovation that in the CHIPS technology that makes the United States actually more competitive. And so we really think that we need to come together and work towards solutions and addressing this chilling effect. These are not just directly impacted communities. They are the members in our country that we need in order to maintain our leadership. So most recently, ASF members authored a report that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is a peer-reviewed journal of the National Academy of Science from which many Nobel laureates have risen from. And what we saw in that report, which surveyed professors of Chinese descent across the country, was that there was this deep fear for many Chinese American and immigrant scholars. About 89% of the respondents said that they want to contribute to US leadership in science and technology, but 72% felt unsafe in the United States. 61% actually felt pressure to leave the US, and this included many junior professionals and federal grant awardees. So we're looking at the next generation of scholars who are fearful of even staying in the United States. 42%, similar to Professor Xuan-Trang, are fearful of just conducting research. And interestingly enough, life scientists, the scholars who are working in curing diseases, are 1.8 times more fearful compared with physical science faculty. And 45% intend to avoid federal grant applications altogether, including and especially senior faculty. So we are really wondering and concerned how we can make sure that this chilling effect in the scholar community doesn't remain. We understand the importance of safeguarding our country, but we really feel that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot when we're diminishing the light and the values that has drawn so many people like Professor Xuan-Trang and many talented and brilliant scientists across the world to come to the US and contribute. So certainly, as you mentioned, Kimmy, there really has been this harmful consequence within the academic and scientific community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Gisela. I'm going to go to Cindy right now. And, I know that Gisela just mentioned a lot of really important and critical research kind of surrounding this topic. And your own organization, Committee of 100, published a paper that mentioned that I believe it was around 50% of scientists of Chinese descent were fearful or had anxiety that they were already under government surveillance. And I was wondering how you feel that that's going to impact their research, their work, and maybe even, Americans as a whole.
Yes, thank you for that question. So the report that Gisela just mentioned was actually something I reviewed recently. And one of the facts that she skipped on, but I think is critical for this conversation, is that Chinese scientists over the last 3 years, and so that study was between 2018 to, so I'm talking about 2018 to 2021, left the United States at an accelerated rate of 75%. So in 2021 alone, over 2,500 Chinese scientists voluntarily left the United States. And I think that number alone can really showcase the impact of how this is going to affect the scientific community in the United States. So the study that you referred to that was conducted by a committee of 100, that was in 2021. We conducted a national survey of nearly 2,000 academic scientists. And really part of it, the goal was to understand the consequences of our nation's policies and initiatives in their efforts to boost their opposition over China, right? So in that study, in addition to the fact that the stat that you provided, over 40% of the Chinese respondents indicated that the government activities like unwarranted FBI searches and investigations and like the China initiative had influenced their plans to stay in the United States. And so all of that combined, I think what we're seeing is the types of policies and initiatives that are being implemented here make Chinese scholars feel not only unwelcome, but extremely unsafe. And by doing this, we are essentially strengthening other countries, including China's research programs. So one thing I recently heard from a high-ranking administrator in a university in China is they share this year, they had the easiest time recruiting scholars to teach at their university. And many of these scholars have recently relocated from the United States. And really, just to state it bluntly, our current approach to competition with China is diverting top talent directly to them.
Yeah, that's such an important point, Cindy. You brought up the China initiative, and I know that was, this Trump era policy. It was, intended to address national security concerns, and then it was extremely controversial because many people felt that it encouraged racial profiling. This next question is for John. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether or not there are legitimate national security concerns, and if there are ways for companies, whether or organizations, to really address national security concerns in a way that does not promote some sort of discrimination, inflame these anxieties and fears.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Kimmy, because we know the effect that all of this is having on our community. Gisela and Cindy really explained that very, very well. So we are not naive to the fact that there are national security concerns. So let's talk about them frankly. What are some of these national security concerns? And number one is to be exact. So we are talking about concerns such as the fact that the Chinese government, that autocratic regime, has stolen information from the American public. If you think about whether it's the Office of Personnel Management, a leak of information, whether it's a healthcare system, there have been instances where there has been state-sponsored espionage. That has been sponsored by the Xi Jinping regime. It has not been done by Chinese scientists or Chinese Americans here in the United States. We could also talk about things such as data privacy. We could also talk about things such as what the Chinese government is doing with respect to democracy, censorship, as an example. We do have concern that the manner in which the Great Firewall has been created in China has resulted in misinformation, disinformation here in the American public. So we as a country should be legitimately thinking about those issues. We as a country should be thinking about whether certain Chinese companies like Huawei or ZTE are violating export controls. But you notice, and this goes to your point about sort of question about whether there's a solution here, I try to be very precise about what these national security concerns are. Too often, what ends up happening is people say, oh, this is in the interest of national security. and that shuts down the conversation, and it legitimizes the attempt by certain people to profile, to portray our community as spies or people that are trying to steal information. Rather, if we talk about things very precisely, whether it is state-sponsored espionage, whether it is specific companies and their conduct, whether it is even something very specific and perhaps even boring, like how do we bolster our semiconductor industry? If we talk about it in that way, then it minimizes the possibility that there's backlash against our community, the Asian American community as a whole. And that's where I think the division is. Now, to be clear, my organization is not a national security expert, so I'm only touching upon what I know in the public news. I did have the fortune of being in the Commerce Department during the Obama administration. So some of these export-import issues, some of these data leak issues that we've seen, certainly I understand them in a different way. And that's what leads me to that understanding, to that belief that we can get this right. We can talk about national security without victimizing a community, but we have to do it with that sort of precision that I'm talking about.
Right, absolutely. And John, I know we've both had so many conversations, as well as I think everyone on this panel, about how important language and precision and nuance has been, especially, you know, when we're talking about an era that's very much painted by COVID. So that's definitely something that is, you know, so key to a lot of these conversations among Asian Americans right now. I'm going to kick it back to Gisela. You know, we've talked about this impact of rising competition within science, within scholarship and academia. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about whether there are unintended consequences on others. You know, when people, you know, look at this topic, they might think, okay, well, this is, you know, for scientists, or this is, you know, for people specifically involved in national security. So could you tell us a little bit about why we should care?
No, and I think that's a great question, Kimmy, because oftentimes we look at the loss of leadership, right, for the United States, the impact on our science and technology space, which is so crucial for us to lift up. But the scientists and scholars are not just tools for one country or another country. They're human beings, and they're really being treated as, you know, collateral damage. These folks are facing not only heightened scrutiny in their places of employment or government, but also the rising hate and violence in our streets. There are many scholars who came to this country precisely for a better life. They didn't want to live under the certain authorities in China at different times. They have their own unique experiences. There are scholars who, when they were children, they saw the Red Guard come into their doors. Their families were intellectuals who were punished precisely because they were pursuing their dreams in science and technology. And so, you know, this is a very traumatizing time for them to be in an environment where there is so much scapegoating of people in science, of Asian Americans, and they have really faced this intersection in how our policies have been changing, but in a way that hasn't really been understanding of the unique circumstances of Asian Americans. And the result is a lot of isolation, people who don't want to speak with their neighbors because they're worried about this sort of brand of being a spy or this cloud of suspicion over them. They have severe financial struggles. Many are living in so much debt just from legal fees and the loss of their livelihood. And the trauma doesn't extend just to the individuals, but also their family members. We have family members that don't ever want to speak about it, who feel a sense of guilt in how they didn't understand the process and the investigations. And so you really have created an environment that has really broken up communities and has really distracted scholars from what they came to the United States to do, which is to live a free, happy life where they're able to pursue their dreams. And we see that it's not just those who are under investigation that are living in fear. As you saw in our past study that I mentioned earlier, many scholars, regardless of whether they're under investigation or they're going through the court system, are extremely anxious about the current environment. They don't know what is considered safe collaboration. They don't know what all the rules are and whether making a mistake could lead to their lives dramatically being impacted the way we've seen for Professor Gang Chen and Professor Xiaoxing Shi and his family. And so I think there's this internal perception from many of the scholars that I've spoken to that they should just keep their head down, try to be quiet, and they don't believe that they could really live their lives the same way that other Asian Americans can, other Americans can in the country. And this is very problematic, right? Many of them, of course, naturally have ties abroad. I have scholars who went on vacation to visit elderly parents, but part of their vacation is also this worry about when they return, will they be stopped at the border? Are their computers, laptops, and communications going to be surveilled? And this really creates a different climate for how they function in their everyday lives. And kind of adding to that, of course, like I mentioned, we're looking at them as people, but it also impacts how well they do in their work. We had a recent research show that investigations by NIH actually led to significant reduction of productivity for American professors in life sciences. This includes their public relations and their citations. And some of those, the most impacted are Asian Americans in our community. We've also seen, as Cindy had lifted up earlier, that there's been a negative net flow of scientists into the United States, but a positive one for both China and Europe. As our president, Professor Yasheng Huang, has mentioned in the past, this is really remarkable in light of the fact that China has become actually less attractive for academics because of increasing restrictions in free speech. And so we really have to ask ourselves, what sort of environment are we creating that are driving people away when there was so much that attracted them to this country in the first place for them and their families?
Right. I remember, speaking with Xiaoxing Shi about a lot of the mental toll that you kind of spoke about, Gisela, and, it just seemed that what his family and those around him had endured was just some unimaginable kind of pain for years. And so that was such an important point. I'm going to go to Cindy now. And Cindy, are we seeing anything kind of these unintended consequences of this competition on Asian American communities, in our everyday lives? Have you seen, whether it is like we did after or during the height of COVID, when there was this kind of, social media rhetoric that really kind of targeted Asian American communities? Are we seeing this leach into other aspects of public life?
Yeah, I think the current environment has affected every Chinese Asian American today, whether you are a STEM professional or not. We have had to adjust to the way we think and do everyday activities. And so we can just use myself as an example. I have no science or technical background, but it has affected me. So for example, for safety reasons, I make a conscious decision not to go outside with a ponytail. Or I've had multiple conversations with friends and family about where it's the best place on a subway station to stand while I'm waiting for the train to arrive. And, for me, I would say these are examples of relatively minor inconveniences. But for my parents, for them not to feel safe to go outside, to use a public transportation, it has had a much more profound impact on their psychological well-being, right? It takes away their independence. They feel like they're being a burden to their children. They feel betrayed by this country, by their neighbors, a place that they've called home for decades, right? And so we are seeing this impact in our community on multiple levels. And really, speaking about feeling like you're at home, there are now over 30 states who have implemented or introduced laws that would restrict Chinese people in the US from purchasing homes or other types of properties. And so in some states, if you are Chinese and you currently own property, you have to register it with the government. And I really want to emphasize what this means, because For many, property ownership is not just for the practical purpose of having a roof over your head, right? It's a signal of stability, of belonging. And people who come to the United States make contributions like the examples Gisela mentioned from her members. They should have a right to feel like they belong here. And currently they don't.
Absolutely, Cindy. And I think it's so important that you brought up, these land laws. I know that Florida in particular has been, a hot topic of conversation among Asian Americans. And I believe it was just pretty recently that the injunction filed by the ACLU had been rejected. And so, yeah, this is just, it has leached, I guess, from what you're saying, into so many different aspects of life. And as you mentioned, it has impacted people's ability to feel at home. John, I'm gonna go to you right now. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether there are steps that those in the public and private sectors might take to mitigate this sort of harm. And even, as we are seeing a lot of these different, whether it is legislation pop up, whether it is kind of more of this surveillance, how does the community, or how do these companies fight back against something like that?
Thank you for that question, Kimmy. I think we have to think about this as a whole of society issue, frankly. And we in the public, Asian Americans have a role to play, journalists have a role to play, politicians, policymakers have a role to play, and the community writ large has a role to play. For the media, and Kimmy, I appreciate all that you are doing in that space, is calling out instances where we are just trying to demonize a group without justification, whether it is the so-called national security threat or using terms like this as an existential threat. Those things don't actually help national security, but paint a target on the backs of Asian Americans, as Gisela and Sydney have talked about, and discourages Asian Americans from engaging in civic society. For private companies, it is talking, number one, maybe to their ERGs, their employee resource groups, and making sure their groups feel comfortable in the environment that they're in. Number two, talking about sort of the actual effect on their businesses. I think Secretary Yellen from the Treasury Department did have it right. We can't talk about decoupling from the Chinese government. As a practical matter, we are always going to be linked, as we are with many, many other nations, in trade, in innovation, in exchanges. And so then it's a question of, okay, private companies speaking up about the fact that they do need to do trade. They do need to have supply chains that are in China. They recognize that there are certain challenges, but that they need to speak up about how it's somewhat idiotic, if I could use that phrase, to suggest that we could decouple and that we should have nothing to do with the Chinese government. And then number three is just speaking out. I always think about some of these policies like the alien land laws. And so what I think about is actually not COVID-19 and what that's done to our community. The analogy I would use is to 9/11 or to World War II. Because those were the same things. 9/11, we had, again, admittedly, a real national security threat caused by terrorists. But the answer was not to demonize the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian American community. And certainly we ended up doing that with some of the racial profiling that happened post 9/11 in our policies, in the so-called name of national security. Likewise, in World War II, yes, we were fighting a war with the Japanese Empire. No question about that. But our legitimate gripe was with Emperor Hirohito and the Prime Minister, not with Americans of Japanese descent here in the United States. But that's where we saw the backlash, the incarceration of Americans of Japanese descent. And so we need to separate those two things. Last thing I would say about this and ask people to think about this in, if you will, three-dimensional sense. If we are looking at any policies related to the US-China relationship, number one, we should be thinking about whether this actually enhances a true national security issue. And when I say a true national security issue, are we doing investigations, hearings, gathering evidence? Are we narrowly defining that issue? What is going to be the effect on foreign relations of taking those steps? Like the alien land laws, candidly, with no offense to the Florida legislature, why does Florida legislature believe that they have the expertise necessary to address national security as on a national basis? So we have to think about, number one is what is the actual effect on national security. Number two is what is the effect on business and innovation. With many of these policies, we're talking about businesses, we're talking about innovation that should be coming to the United States. And as Giselle and Cindy both talked about, we're seeing a brain drain, which is not helping the United States. It also has a negative effect on our national security. So we should be talking about the effect on business and innovation. And number three, and clearly not least of those, is the effect on our community. And that's the one that's most often forgotten right now. That's why I appreciate these conversations. Having these conversations about what is the effect that is having on the Chinese American, Asian American, but frankly, all of these communities. Like the alien land law that Cindy talked about also targets Iranians, Russians, and North Koreans. And depending on some of these legislations, Cubans could be implicated, Venezuelans could be implicated. So we're not just talking about an Asian American issue either. We need to be nuanced in how we talk about these issues, very specific and precise. By doing that, it takes away the backlash. It takes away this feeling of us versus them. And it allows us to actually address the policy issues that we need to address.
Absolutely, John. I was wondering if I could just ask you a quick follow-up about that, because you did bring up a couple events in history, including, 9/11, which I think we all remember how, something like that, there ended up being that national security program, that registration program that targeted mostly Muslim men and boys that didn't actually result in a single sort of conviction there. So I am wondering if we could look to, even something like Vincent Chin, which I think was very much related to this issue of competition, where, it was very much kind of what we saw the rise of the Japanese auto industry. And then there was also, of course, that racial profiling component. Are there lessons that were learned or discussed during that period that have not yet really kind of sunk in? Are there different things that we really need to be looking to the past for a little bit more guidance here?
I appreciate the reference to Vincent Chin. I will admit that I did not use that in the initial instance just because I know that some viewers will not know who that is. And I very much appreciate that summary. You're absolutely right. At the end of the day, Vincent Chin was killed because of a Japanese-US auto trade war in the 1980s. You could talk about hate crimes, you could talk about the fact that he was Asian American, you could talk about how bad these other actors were. But at the end of the day, it was a trade issue that caused his death. And so there are absolutely lessons to be learned. I think about World War II in terms of another lesson that can be learned. German Americans did not face the same type of racial profiling as Japanese Americans did. Now, why is that? Part of it was, even during that time, if you look at the literature, they were very clear to talk about Nazism. They were very clear to talk about Hitler as the problem. They did not talk about sort of the Japanese as a whole, right? And we know that that's not even the term that they used during the World War II. So bring it to today. Even now, yes, we're in a hot war, or Russia is in a hot war with Ukraine. We talk about the Putin regime. So perhaps in the appropriate circumstances, we should talk about the Xi Jinping regime, right? Because let's be clear, again, Xi Jinping as an actor has been autocratic, has been abusive towards human rights. So we need to call those out. But by talking about people, talking about particular regimes, particular actors, then it doesn't make it about a group as a whole. So that's another lesson that I think we can learn. I think another lesson certainly is after 9/11. The Patriot Act, again, I understand it. I understand why the national sentiment was what it was. And frankly, that's what, in some ways, we saw with the China initiative, was because the national sentiment had turned towards that US-China friction, and there was this need to racial profile. So there are many lessons to be learned. Unfortunately, I will say with some sadness, I'm not sure we're learning them all the time, or we're not actually internalizing them in our policies and in our rhetoric.
Thank you so much for that, John. And I think it's so important to kind of look to history to kind of assess whether or not there has been any progress or not. And it sounds like from what you're saying, there really has not been, sufficient, I guess, these lessons absorbed, I guess, within a lot of our companies or public. I'm going to turn to, all our panelists to give kind of a final couple words about some tangible things that either the Asian American community or allies can do to kind of ensure that our spaces are inclusive. I think that there's always been a question of whether the burden should always fall on Asian American communities alone to lift themselves up during a time when there has already been concerns, anxieties, fears over racial profiling. So I kind of wanted to open it up and see if there were strategies for kind of everyone and also those within the community to kind of, preserve their mental health, preserve their safety. I think I'm going to first start with Cindy. If you could talk a little bit about some of these tangible, practical things that we can really do.
Sure. So I have three in mind, and they're kind of all over the spectrum. The one that probably people hear frequently is that they really should engage with their local, state, and federal representatives. Talk to them, let them know that, one, you're here, right? We talk about being the invisible population. So stand out, go talk to your representative, let them know what are the issues that's affecting you, your family, your community. The second is to both support and lean on your community AAPI organizations, whether it's community centers or national organizations like AAJC, AASF, or Committee of 100. We have resources as well as programs that can really provide guidance as well as assistance when impacted people need just more direct service. I want to go back to what you said earlier in posing the question, is the burden on us? And it's, in my opinion, it is on us. And so this is uncomfortable, but I think every single person should make an effort to interact with non-Asians, whether it's in your workplace, your school, your neighborhood, share your heritage and your culture with them, but also show that you are 100% as American as they are. That then humanizes our entire community when somebody who may have misconceptions about the Chinese population, they can now think back and say, hey, I know so-and-so, he or she is Chinese. They're not like that. I don't see them as a threat. They just want to do the same thing I want to do. I do think that understanding and just mutual interaction can be extremely beneficial.
Thanks so much, Cindy. I'm going to go next to John. If you could talk a little bit about, what some things that Asian Americans and also just allies outside of the community should be doing in a time like this to make our spaces more inclusive.
I completely agree with Cindy that part of it is we as Asian Americans need to use our voice. We need to show up and we need to talk to our legislators. We also need to show up in solidarity with other communities. It's not lost on me that the alien land law passed in Florida comes from the same legislature that is erasing African American history, that the same legislature that is repealing LGBTQ rights. So we as Asian Americans also need to stand up for those groups because they're part of the same community that is being marginalized. Yes, the strands of the racism and the bigotry may be different, but the disease is absolutely the same. This notion that you don't belong. For us, it's because we are seen as foreigners. We are seen as spies. For LGBTQ community, they're seen as something different, to use their words, deviant in some way. For the African-American community, because they are seen as lesser. So we need to show up for all of these communities. Yes, these issues that we are talking about, we care deeply about them and they are important to us. But we can't forget in Florida, there was a killing in Jacksonville that was specifically race-based. So we as Asian Americans also need to speak up about that, because once we do that, we build that solidarity between all of our communities so that we have even greater strength in fighting it back against whether they're policy proposals, media portrayals or just general community sentiment.
Thanks so much, John. And yeah, I'm glad you brought up some of the other issues that are bubbling up in the Florida legislature. I know that a lot of Asian American groups, national Asian American groups, kind of spoke out after Asian American history was implemented in Florida curriculum. However, other groups, including Black history, had kind of been striked from a lot of the AP courses. And so I think a lot of people were saying that overall, we can't necessarily celebrate that as a win if all communities are not rising in that moment. I'm going to go to you, Gisela. If you could talk, a little bit about some of the things that both Asian Americans and allies can be doing. I know that one theme that's come up now is just coalition building and kind of seeking that supporting others and kind of seeking support in that way. If you could talk a little bit about what you think there.
Thank you, Kimmy. And absolutely, I think coalition building is so critical because in many ways, the Asian American community, we need as much help as possible. We all have limited capacity. And so it's so important for us to work together and create more capacity for our communities to advocate. And I think you raised up an interesting point, Kimmy, in terms of the burden on Asian Americans. I think it is very much a challenge. We have impacted members of our community who don't always want to speak up. It could be re-traumatizing for them to share their story time and time again. However, one of the things that we're working on is making sure that we lift them up and empower them to make sure that what they went through was not for nothing, and that there are ways that we can create change. We really think that in many ways, the first step is to make sure that those who are impacted, because regardless of whether they act or not, they are going to bear the brunt of many of these policies. They should be in the room when these decisions are made, and their experiences should be centered. And that's a big reason why ASF came into existence. It's very critical for federal agencies and academic institutions to listen to the voices of their Asian American scholars, their faculty, and scientists. That is really, I think, the only way for us to come up with nuanced, genuine solutions that's informed by what's happening on the ground. Second is, John had raised a really critical point in how cyclical many of these issues are, right? Racial justice and the treatment of Asian Americans is so intrinsically tied to this perception of us being foreign. And it has really made us convenient scapegoats whenever the United States has tensions with a foreign country. And so we need to build up more infrastructure within the nonprofit space. And we need support from others outside to invest in us so that we could be empowered to have a voice for our community. And I think that really has been one of the most critical issues for Asian Americans and for our civil rights organizations. The other thing is knowing that these are cyclical issues, we need the federal government to create appropriate systems in place that provides these necessary checks and balances that protects vulnerable communities. We know that racial bias exists, and so it should not come as a surprise. We need due process in place, methods for individuals to file complaints if they believe that they've been wrongfully treated. But right now, if you're a scholar and you're concerned that you have been mistreated or that you have experienced racial bias, in many ways, there are not that many avenues for you to find assistance, to find help, or to be able to be a voice to change some of these policies. So we really hope that we remain critical, that we ask questions and we listen to those who are going to be facing the brunt of many of these policies. I think one of our concerns here at AASF is that some of these new policies and laws may seem, initially kind of facially neutral, as if they won't have some sort of racial impact. But upon implementation, it does disproportionately impact Asian Americans. And so we're really hoping that much of these policies have avenues for change, that it could be data-driven. Many of the scholars love data. They want to help. They want to give feedback. They want to show what's happening on the ground. And we need time for the community to be able to process all of these changing rules. You know, ASF is so concerned that we're adding further disclosure requirements and restrictions when many of our federal agencies haven't even implemented these changes. And so we really hope that there could be more accountability, due process, and listening to the people here on the ground that are impacted.
Thank you so much, Gisela. I'm going to kick it to John very quickly. I know you had something to mention. We were talking previously about whether or not that burden should be on Asian Americans to kind of lift themselves up during this time, and what allies should be doing. How are you feeling about that? Do you think Asian Americans should be the one?
Thank you, Kimmy. As I was thinking about the question and the use of the term burden, I really appreciate that, because on one level, I think it is our burden. But to be clear, to those that say, well, it shouldn't just be our burden alone, the African-American community, it was their burden to get civil rights for all of us back in the 1960s. So we shouldn't feel like we are entitled to have other people help us. And so this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of solidarity, this notion that we need to come together, that yes, we have a special burden at that point, but it's also a privilege to be able to carry that burden and do our part in that civil rights movement.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, John. And I want to thank everyone on this panel. I think the discussion was so lovely, and I think that there are so many kind of takeaways that we can keep from this day. I had such a great time talking to all of you, and I learned so much. So again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much to APAICS. I always mess up the pronunciation of that altogether because I'm not cool enough to do it. But also, yeah, thank you so much. And see you next time, guys.